The evening drive, Elijah Hart, a man who had seen more of life than most could imagine, let out a deep sigh as he guided his brand new Lexus down the winding streets of his neighborhood in Maplewood Heights, an upscale community known for its peace and quiet. It had been a long, grueling day in court, one of those days that tested his patience and resolve. But now, with the cool evening air slipping through his cracked window and the smooth rhythm of jazz enveloping him, he felt a familiar sense of calm. His work as a judge often left him drained, but the drive home was always his escape, a space to breathe and reflect. Elijah was no stranger to challenges. His journey to becoming a judge had been anything but easy. As a young black man growing up in the inner city, he had to fight for every inch of his success. Law school had been a battlefield, and even as he rose through the ranks, he had faced discrimination from those who couldn't accept that someone like him could hold so much authority. But he had persevered, fueled by the belief that justice was for everyone, regardless of race or background. His achievements were a testament to his resilience and determination. Today, he was in his element, a well-respected figure in the legal system, a mentor to many, and a role model to young black men who saw in him what was possible when you defy the odds. As he cruised past the sprawling homes of Maplewood Heights, he allowed himself to relax, smiling faintly as the smooth leather of the seats cradled him in comfort. Life had been good, and this Lexus, just a week old, was his latest indulgence. It represented more than just a car. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. The sun had just begun its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Elijah loved this time of day. It reminded him of simpler times before the weight of his responsibilities had settled on his shoulders. But just as he was about to turn up the volume on the jazz playing softly through the speakers, a flash of red and blue lights caught his attention. His stomach tightened. Elijah glanced in the rearview mirror, where a police cruiser had pulled up behind him, its lights flashing insistently. He blinked in confusion. He hadn't been speeding. He was certain of that. In fact, he'd been driving well below the limit, enjoying the leisurely pace. His heart began to race, and a familiar unease crept into his chest. He had heard stories, too many, in fact, about encounters like this. But surely not here, not in his own neighborhood. Reluctantly, Elijah signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, the cruiser following closely behind. The tranquil atmosphere of the neighborhood was shattered as the flashing lights painted the quiet streets in a harsh, rhythmic glow. Elijah's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, a sense of dread beginning to settle over him. He reminded himself who he was, a respected judge, a man of authority. This had to be a misunderstanding. As Officer Marks muttered into her radio, Elijah's thoughts raced. He had spent decades building a career that embodied fairness and justice, standing as a symbol of integrity in the courtroom. But in this moment, none of it seemed to matter. He was reduced to just another black man being suspected of a crime he hadn't committed. No matter how many cases he had presided over, no matter how many lives he had impacted, his skin color still dictated the way people perceived him. The sting of that truth settled deep into his chest, heavier than the humiliation he felt. The radio crackled, and Officer Marks stepped back from him slightly, listening intently to the garbled voice on the other end. Her expression flickered between impatience and uncertainty. But Elijah caught a glimpse of something else: fear. Perhaps not fear of him, but fear of the consequences of her actions. She was beginning to realize the gravity of the situation, though the weight of her assumptions still hung in the air between them. Elijah's thoughts drifted to his family, his wife Naomi, and their two children, Jonah and Sophia. He thought of the talks he'd had with his son about how to navigate situations like this, how to stay calm in the face of injustice, and how to de-escalate when emotions ran high. He had hoped that his own accomplishments, his own story, would serve as proof that a black man could rise above prejudice. But now, standing in the spotlight of racial profiling, Elijah understood more deeply than ever how ingrained the bias was, how pervasive. His son Jonah had once asked him, "Dad, does it ever get better? Do people ever really stop seeing us like this?" Elijah had paused, unsure of how to answer, not wanting to crush his son's hopes with the hard truth. He had told Jonah to stay strong, to stay dignified, and to never let anyone strip him of his worth. But here Elijah stood, feeling the very dignity he had fought for being eroded under the scrutiny of an officer who saw only his skin color and not the man behind it. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Finally, the radio crackled again, and Officer Marks visibly tensed. Elijah could hear the voice on the other end, though he couldn't make out the words. But it didn't matter. The officer's face said it all. She had made a mistake, a colossal one, and now she had to confront the reality of what she had done. Elijah turned slowly, lowering his hands from the car, his gaze steady as he met Officer Marks's eyes. "Well?" he asked, his voice low but firm, every word carefully measured. "What now, officer?" A sharp knock on his window made him jump. Elijah turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered officer standing just outside the driver's side window, her face hard and unreadable. Her badge gleamed under the streetlight. "License and registration," Officer Kelly Marks barked, her tone cold, devoid of any courtesy. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a command. Elijah's brow furrowed in confusion, but he complied, retrieving his documents from the glove compartment and handing them to her. She snatched them from his hands, barely glancing at them before shifting her gaze back to him. Her eyes narrowed, scrutinizing him in a way that made his skin crawl. "Step out of the car," she ordered, her voice hard, leaving no room for argument. Elijah blinked, momentarily stunned. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with confusion. "I said, step out of the car," she repeated more forcefully this time. Her hand rested on the gun holstered at her side, and something in her stance told Elijah this was not a request. His pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. He had faced situations like this before, though not since he'd earned the title of judge. He knew his rights. He knew the law. He also knew that in moments like this, staying calm was crucial. "Ma'am, there must be some kind of mistake," Elijah began, his voice measured. "I'm Judge Elijah Hart. This is my vehicle. I live just down the street." Officer Marks raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanging. "Step out of the vehicle, Judge, or we'll have a problem," she said, her hand tightening around the grip of her holstered gun. Elijah's stomach dropped. He had expected her demeanor to soften at the mention of his position. After all, he had presided over countless cases in this very district. Yet she showed no recognition, no respect. His title seemed meaningless to her. Swallowing his rising frustration, Elijah pushed open the car door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood beside his vehicle, his heart pounding in his chest as Officer Marks eyed him, circling him like a predator assessing its prey. The quiet street, once peaceful, now felt oppressive, as though the very air had thickened with tension. "We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area," she said, her eyes flicking between Elijah and his car. "This Lexus matches the description." Elijah's jaw tightened. "This is my car. I purchased it from the dealership just days ago. If you run the plates, you'll see everything checks out." But Officer Marks didn't seem to care. Her gaze lingered on him, suspicion etched into every line of her face. "Hands on the hood," she ordered. Elijah hesitated. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice low, barely containing his disbelief. "Hands on the hood," she snapped, stepping closer, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Elijah clenched his jaw but complied, placing his hands on the smooth surface of his car's hood. As he did, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision, neighbors peeking out from behind curtains, their faces barely visible as they watched the unfolding spectacle. The humiliation stung more than the cold metal beneath his hands. Officer Marks began patting him down, her hands rough and mechanical, as though she had already convicted him in her mind. "This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week," she muttered, her voice devoid of empathy. "I've already told you." Elijah said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This car is mine." But Officer Marks wasn't listening. She didn't care. To her, he was just another suspect, another black man in a nice car. As she reached for her handcuffs, Elijah knew he had to act. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He wasn't going to let this happen, not without a fight. "Before you make a decision you'll regret," he said, his voice steady. "I suggest you call your superior." Officer Marks paused, her hand hovering above the cuffs. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Elijah met her gaze, unflinching. Do your job properly, officer. Run my plates and call your captain. The tension between them hung thick in the air, but finally, with a muttered curse under her breath, Officer Marks reached for her radio. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, but for Elijah, the damage was already done. The weight of injustice pressed down on him, heavier than the humiliation he felt in that moment. Elijah stood still, his hands pressed against the cool hood of his car as Officer Marks fumbled with her radio, her rigid demeanor faltering for the first time. The night, once serene, now felt charged with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to pulse through the entire neighborhood. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors burning into his back, their curiosity mingled with judgment. This wasn't just a routine stop, it was an exhibition, and Elijah was the unwilling star. For a moment, she didn't respond. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and stubborn defiance. Her hand, which had been hovering over her radio, dropped to her side. She took a step back, exhaling sharply as though trying to regain her composure, but it was clear she was shaken. Her earlier arrogance had melted away, replaced by the dawning realization that she had overstepped her authority in a way that couldn't be undone. "Aya," she began, stumbling over her words. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Elijah raised an eyebrow, the anger he had been holding back bubbling just beneath the surface. "A misunderstanding?" he echoed, the disbelief in his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Is that what we're calling it, Officer Marks? A misunderstanding?" Her face flushed a deep red, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. There was no justification that could explain away her actions. The weight of her own prejudice hung over her like a dark cloud, and she knew it. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and thick, until finally the sound of another engine broke the tension. A second police cruiser pulled up, and Elijah recognized the man who stepped out, Chief Daniels. The chief was a seasoned officer with grey streaks peppering his dark hair and a weary look in his eyes that spoke of years spent navigating the politics of law enforcement. He moved with purpose, his face set in a stern expression as he approached the scene. "Judge Hart," Chief Daniels called out as he neared, his tone filled with urgency and concern. "I'm so sorry about this. We got the call and, well, it looks like there's been a terrible mistake." Elijah crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw clenched. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice filled with bitterness. "That's the word we keep using tonight, isn't it?" Daniels stopped a few feet from Elijah, his eyes briefly flicking to Officer Marks, who stood stiffly to the side, her face burning with shame. The chief exhaled heavily before turning back to Elijah. "I can't tell you how sorry I am, sir. This is unacceptable." Elijah's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he kept his voice steady. "Sorry won't undo what's already been done, Chief. I was humiliated in front of my own neighbors, my character, my integrity, reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes. What happens next? What do you do about this?" Daniels ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "We'll handle this internally, Judge. I'll make sure Officer Marks faces the consequences. This isn't something we take lightly." Elijah studied the chief's face, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of real accountability. He had seen too many situations like this, where officers were reprimanded behind closed doors, but the system that allowed such blatant racism to thrive remained unchanged. He had no interest in a half-hearted apology or a slap on the wrist. This moment was bigger than him, and he knew it. "I want more than just an internal review, Chief," Elijah said, his voice hardening. "I want this to be public. I want this to be addressed in front of the community so people see that there are real consequences for racial profiling. I want transparency, and I want action." Daniels hesitated, glancing again at Officer Marks, who had gone pale at Elijah's words. "Judge, I understand your frustration, but—" "No, Chief," Elijah interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You don't understand. Not really. You've never had to live with this. But I do, and so does every other black man and woman who's been in my position. If we don't make this right, if we don't hold people accountable, it's going to keep happening." The chief swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "You're absolutely right." Elijah took a deep breath, the tension in his chest loosening just a fraction. "Then do something about it," he said simply. Chief Daniels glanced at Officer Marks once more, then turned back to Elijah. "I will, Judge. I promise you, I will." But Elijah had heard promises like this before, and as he stood there watching Chief Daniels attempt to salvage the situation, he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. A battle not just for his dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had ever been wrongly judged, not by their actions, but by the color of their skin. As the night deepened around them, Elijah turned back toward his car, his mind already racing with the next steps he would take. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot.